a stem cell, I hear you ask? To best understand this, we're going to start at the very beginning. The first step towards the production of a new person is the generation of a single cell when a sperm enters an egg. The cell can multiply by splitting in two, making two identical copies of itself. Now, if it kept doing this, you'd just end up with a mass of cells, not, a new person. A fully formed person, like you or me, is made up of lots of different kinds of cells, like red blood cells, or neurons, or skin cells, or muscle cells, etc. We call these cells adult cells. So how do we get from one cell to a whole lot of different types of cells? When a cell divides, it can do one of three things. It can do what I already mentioned. It can divide and form two identical cells, or it can divide and form a new cell type. Now it can do this in one of two ways. It can divide into two cells where one of the cells is different from the original cell, or it can divide in a way so that both of the newly formed cells are different from the original cell. This process where a cell divides and one of the newly formed cells is essentially different from the original cell is called differentiation. Right, so back to our new person. So this cell first divides to make more of itself. And after it's built up a small group of identical cells, some of these start to differentiate. The different cell types they make up start to arrange themselves in a sort of pattern. So you end up with a few different kinds of cells. You end up with a sphere of cells on the outside of a ball, and on the inside there's a small mass of cells. The sphere of cells on the outside will differentiate to form the placenta, and all the cells in the middle will continue differentiating and replicating until you've generated all the different adult cell types. In this process, the cells rearrange themselves so that they end up forming a whole new person who is comprised of all the different types of adult cell types that you find in a fully formed person. So any of these identical cells in the middle of this embryo can, over time, through many processes of differentiation and replication, form any adult cell type. Because these can ultimately form any adult cell type, we term these pluripotent. Here's the point where scientific research comes in. Every now and again, a generous person will donate one of the extra embryos they developed in their IVF treatments to research. And a researcher will take this inner clump of cells and extract it from the embryo and put it into a dish to culture in the lab. These cells, being cultured in the lab, are now termed embryonic stem cells. I'll put a shorthand here. Embryonic stem cells. By the way, the first time this was done with human cells was in 1998. Okay, back to the embryo. These cells in the embryo now start to differentiate to all different cell types, but the way they get from this pluripotent cell state all the way to the adult state, well, they do that just a bit at a time. These pluripotent cells in the middle of the embryo don't simply make one cell division and end up as these fully differentiated adult cell types. There are all these intermediate steps. Each one of these intermediate cell types is still called a stem cell. I mean, that's one of the definitions of stem cells. The key definition of a stem cell is it has the ability to differentiate. Once it's gone all the way to a red blood cell or a nerve cell or any other kind of adult cell, it's no longer a stem cell, it is fully differentiated. And most of the cells in these intermediate stages are called multipotent. So remember how these cells up here are pluripotent because they can form any adult cell type? Well, in these intermediate stages, these cells haven't committed to becoming any specific adult cell type yet. So an intermediate stage, for example, might be a blood type stem cell. For example, this cell here might know that it's going to become some sort of blood type cell. It might be a red blood cell or a white blood cell or some other kind. But it's definitely not going to end up being some sort of brain cell. So this kind of cell here, we would term multipotent. It can still differentiate into a wide variety of cells, but it can't form any cell type. On the other hand, a cell over here might have decided that it's going to become some sort of muscle cell, so it will differentiate towards becoming more like a muscle cell, but it's definitely not going to become some sort of a blood cell. Right, so now we've got a full baby human, so are all the stem cells gone? Well, actually, no. There are such things as adult stem cells. These are cells that exist in the fully formed human, but that haven't totally differentiated yet. They exist as discrete pools of stem cells in your body, such as brain-type stem cells that might generate different types of cells you have in your brain, blood-type stem cells that generate things like red or white blood cells, or skin-type stem cells that generate all the different kinds of layers of skin you have. But these cells are not pluripotent. They keep replicating themselves, occasionally differentiating, existing as a pool of constantly renewable cells to fix up your body when it gets injured or replace cells when old ones die off. For example, some of the stem cells you find in bone marrow are blood-specific stem cells. So they are stem cells that can generate red blood cells, white blood cells, or other types of blood cells. Where were we? Pluripotent cells, adult stem cells, embryonic stem cells... Right. Aside from their ability to differentiate, the other key point about stem cells is their ability to renew potentially indefinitely. So all your adult cells can only divide a limited number of times before they essentially just give up and die. Sorry. Stem cells, however, in the right conditions, will just keep on making more of themselves. Forever. This is one of the key purposes of adult stem cells. When, for example, a skin cell has replicated so many times it can't be bothered anymore, it will just die. If this kept happening, you'd run out of skin. You have skin stem cells that keep renewing indefinitely, and occasionally some of these will differentiate to provide you with brand new, fully differentiated adult skin cells so that you don't run out of skin. In a lab, we can grow embryonic stem cells in a dish, and we can actually grow them in conditions that force them to differentiate into different adult cell types. So we can actually take a dish of embryonic stem cells, and we can force all those cells to become all red blood cells, or all nerve cells, or all kidney cells. We're pretty keen on doing this kind of thing. We can generate almost any of these adult cell types from a batch of embryonic stem cells, because remember, these are pluripotent. And of course we can take adult stem cells and grow them in a dish too. There is just one other kind of stem cell I want to mention. But Steph, I hear you say, you've covered the whole process of human development. What other kinds of stem cells could there be? Stem cells that we grow in the lab are essentially mimics of what happens in a developing organism. We conduct experiments on these cells in a dish to mimic what happens in a developing organism to help us understand it better. But the last cell type I want to mention doesn't mimic anything that happens in biology. So some clever people in 2007 figured out that if you take a fully differentiated adult cell, like a skin cell, you could actually grow it in certain conditions, with certain expensive reagents, and then change the cells back into a pluripotent state. So they have similar properties to embryonic stem cells, but they're not embryonic stem cells because you didn't get them from an embryo. These newly generated pluripotent cells are called induced pluripotent stem cells, or iPSC for short. Just like with embryonic stem cells, you can take these induced pluripotent stem cells and you can cause them to differentiate to any adult cell type in the dish. This process of reprogramming an adult cell to become pluripotent doesn't happen in nature, which may explain why this guy got a Nobel Prize in 2012 for developing this process. So now you know why it kind of bugs me when people talk about stem cells as though it's just one kind of cell. There's so many different types of stem cells, and research that involves them has drastically different interpretations if you're talking about adult stem cells or embryonic stem cells. So I hope that's cleared things up. Thanks for listening. Person is the formation of a single cell from the